170,000. That is the number of landmines German forces planted across Finnish and Soviet Lapland alone during their retreat in 1944 and 1945. But mines were only one piece of a vast industrialized system of destruction. When the Wehrmacht pulled back across Europe, they left behind something far more sinister than scorched earth. They left behind invisible clocks, ticking inside walls, beneath floorboards, hidden in the rubble of civilization. These were delayed fuse devices, engineered not just to kill, but to kill at the precise moment when Allied forces believed they were finally safe. This is the story of industrial-scale sabotage, a logistics network of death that stretched from the laboratories of the Reich to every city, village and roadway the German army abandoned. Curious. If you find this kind of deep military history fascinating, take a moment now to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. You are joining a community of hundreds of thousands who believe that understanding the past is the key to understanding the future. Now, let us examine the machinery of delayed destruction. The concept was brutally simple in its logic, yet staggering in its ambition. When an army retreats, it faces a fundamental problem. The enemy will occupy the ground you leave behind. They will use your former headquarters for planning, your former barracks for rest, your former roads for supply. The traditional answer was demolition, blowing bridges and burning depots as you leave. But the Germans understood something more insidious. Immediate destruction could be repaired. What if the destruction came later? What if the enemy had already settled in, already felt secure, already lowered their guard? The psychological and logistical damage would be multiplied 100-fold. And so, from the highest levels of German military engineering came the doctrine of the delayed fuse trap. These were not improvised devices. They were factory-produced mechanisms, manufactured by the thousands in German industrial plants, shipped to the front in standardized crates, and deployed according to detailed military protocols. Consider the scale of production required. A single retreating German division might leave behind dozens of booby-trapped locations. Multiply that by the hundreds of divisions operating across multiple fronts, from the steppes of Russia to the hills of Italy, from the forests of France to the fjords of Norway. The Wehrmacht deployed tens of thousands of prepared charges during the war. Each charge required a reliable timing mechanism, stable explosives, weatherproof housings, and trained sappers to install them correctly. The Germans established entire training programs for this purpose. Specialized engineer battalions learned not only how to plant these devices, but how to do so in ways that would evade detection for days, weeks, even months. This was not guerrilla warfare. This was industrial sabotage on an assembly line scale. The mechanisms themselves were marvels of malevolent engineering. The simplest delayed fuse devices used chemical timers. A glass vial containing acid was held in place by a thin wire. When the wire was cut or released, the vial would tip, and the acid would slowly eat through a second wire or a thin metal plate. The thickness of the plate determined the delay, from hours to weeks. Other devices used clockwork mechanisms, wound springs that would slowly unwind over a predetermined period before releasing a striker onto a detonator. The precision of German watchmaking was turned to the purpose of delayed killing. Still other devices used barometric or temperature triggers designed to detonate when the pressure or temperature changed in specific ways, making them nearly impossible to predict. The variety was intentional. If the Allies learned to detect one type of timer, there were a dozen others waiting to surprise them. The deployment doctrine was equally systematic. German military manuals specified categories of locations for delayed fuse placement. Priority targets included headquarters buildings, communication centres, and any structure likely to be commandeered by Allied officers. The logic was precise: kill the commanders and you cripple the advance. Secondary targets included infrastructure, bridges that had been repaired just enough to look usable, railway junctions, power stations, and water treatment facilities. Tertiary targets were psychological: churches, hospitals, schools, any location where the explosion would shatter morale and spread fear. The Germans understood that terror was a force multiplier. Every delayed explosion would make the Allies hesitate before entering any building, slow their advance, consume their engineering resources in endless searches for hidden death. The city of Naples provides a case study in industrial-scale delayed sabotage. When Allied forces entered Naples in October 1943, they believed the city was secured. German forces had retreated northward. The initial booby traps, the obvious ones placed in doorways and on furniture, were found and cleared within days. But the Germans had planted something far more patient. Deep within the Naples Central Post Office, one of the most important communication hubs in southern Italy, a delayed fuse bomb lay hidden. It had been placed weeks before the German withdrawal, its timer set for an unprecedented duration. The device waited. Days passed. Weeks passed. Allied communication officers worked in the building, routing messages, coordinating supply lines, directing the Italian campaign. And then, approximately 45 days after the Germans had left, the bomb detonated. The explosion tore through the building with devastating force. The death toll included both military personnel and Italian civilians who had returned to work in the postal service. But the physical casualties were only part of the damage. The psychological impact rippled through every Allied headquarters in Italy. If a bomb could wait 45 days, how long might others wait? 50 days? 60? 100? Suddenly, no building in any recently liberated city could be trusted. The Allies were forced to implement exhaustive search protocols, deploying thousands of engineers to examine every structure before occupation. This consumed time, manpower, and resources that would otherwise have gone to the offensive. The single bomb in Naples cost the Germans perhaps a few hundred marks in materials and a few hours of a sapper's time. It cost the Allies weeks of delay and untold millions in diverted resources. This was the industrial efficiency of delayed destruction. The Eastern Front saw the same tactics deployed on an even larger scale. When Soviet forces reoccupied Kiev in September 1941, they knew the city had been held by the Germans. What they did not know was that NKVD agents, the Soviet secret police, had remained behind specifically to plant delayed action bombs. But the Soviets were not alone in using such tactics. As the war turned and the Germans began their long retreat from Russia, they employed delayed fuse devices with methodical precision. The retreating Wehrmacht left behind explosive gifts in every major city, every rail junction, every bridge. The Soviet advance was slowed not by defensive lines, but by the constant need to clear invisible threats. Soviet engineers developed their own protocols, but the sheer volume of German devices overwhelmed their capacity. Explosions continued for months after cities were liberated. The mathematics of industrial sabotage favored the defender in retreat. Consider the asymmetry. A single trained sapper could plant a dozen delayed fuse devices in a single night. Each device might require a team of engineers several hours to locate and disarm, assuming they could find it at all. The ratio of effort was perhaps 1 to 50. For every hour the Germans invested in planting traps, the Allies invested 50 hours in searching for them. This was the same logic that made landmines so devastatingly effective, but applied to the urban and infrastructural environment. The Germans were not just destroying buildings. They were destroying time, the most precious resource in a fast-moving war. Take a moment now to like this video if you are learning something new. Engagement helps this channel continue to bring you these deep dives into military history. And now, let us examine the specific engineering of these devices in greater detail. The standard German demolition charge, the Sprengkörper, came in several standardized weights and configurations. The most common variants held between 2 and 10 kilograms of high explosive, typically a mixture of TNT and RDX, stable compounds that would not degrade over time. These charges were designed to be modular. A sapper could combine multiple charges to create larger explosions, or use a single small charge for more discrete applications. The packaging was waterproof and shockproof, allowing the charges to be buried in the ground, submerged in water, or hidden in damp cellars without degradation. German chemical engineers had perfected these formulations over years of testing, and the reliability rate was exceptionally high. Unlike improvised explosives, factory-produced charges almost never failed to detonate when triggered. The timing mechanisms showed similar sophistication. The standard mechanical timer used a spring wound clock escapement, the same basic mechanism found in pocket watches. The Germans were the world's premier watchmakers, and they applied this expertise to instruments of destruction. A typical timer could be set for delays ranging from 15 minutes to 21 days, with reasonable accuracy. For longer delays, chemical timers were preferred. These used a variety of corrosive agents, sulfuric acid, hydrofluoric acid, or specialized proprietary compounds whose formulas remain classified. The acid would slowly dissolve a barrier, releasing a spring-loaded striker. The thickness and composition of the barrier determined the delay. German chemists calibrated these barriers to achieve delays of 30, 60, or even 90 days with acceptable precision. But precision was relative. The timers were accurate to within perhaps 20% of their intended delay. A 30-day timer might detonate anywhere from 24 to 36 days after activation. This unpredictability was actually an advantage. It meant that the Allies could never be certain when a building was truly safe. Even after weeks of occupation, there might be a bomb waiting with a 90-day timer. The psychological uncertainty was as damaging as the explosions themselves. Allied commanders had to assume that any building might contain a ticking threat indefinitely. The placement of these devices showed tactical intelligence. German sappers were trained to think like their enemies. Where would an Allied officer establish his headquarters? In the largest, most impressive building in town, typically the town hall or the finest hotel. Where would Allied communication officers set up their equipment? In the post office or telephone exchange, where existing infrastructure could be repurposed. Where would Allied quartermasters store their supplies? In warehouses and cellars, protected from weather and air attack. Each of these locations received priority attention from German demolition teams. The bombs were hidden in walls, beneath floors, inside furniture, within the very infrastructure that made the buildings useful. Removing them would require either finding the hidden device or demolishing the building entirely. Neither option was acceptable when the Allies needed functioning infrastructure for their own advance. The case of Bapaume provides a striking example from the First World War, proving that these tactics had deep roots. When German forces retreated from the town in March 1917, they left behind more than the usual destruction. An explosive device had been placed in the town hall, fitted with a time-delayed fuse. The bomb was intended to kill members of an Allied headquarters unit, the officers who would inevitably move into the most prominent building in town. The explosion, when it came, achieved its intended purpose. High-ranking officers were eliminated in a single blast, their planning documents destroyed, their staffs thrown into chaos. After the war, This incident was studied extensively by military planners on all sides. The lesson was clear. Delayed fuse devices worked. They would become standard doctrine in the next conflict. The Germans refined these tactics to near perfection during the Second World War. They established schools for demolition, where engineers studied not only the technical aspects of explosives, but also the psychology of their enemies. Students learned to anticipate Allied behavior patterns. They studied the standard operating procedures of British, American, and Soviet forces. They learned where officers slept, where they ate, where they held their briefings. Every piece of behavioral intelligence was incorporated into the placement doctrine. A bomb might be hidden not in the most obvious location, but in the third most obvious location, the one a thorough searcher might find after checking the first two and concluding the building was clear. The deception was layered and deliberate. Dummy devices added another dimension to the industrial sabotage system. German sappers routinely planted fake booby traps alongside real ones. A wire might lead to nothing, or to a non-functional timer, or to an empty charge casing. The purpose was to exhaust Allied engineers. If 9 out of 10 suspicious devices turned out to be dummies, the searchers would eventually grow careless. They would rush through inspections, miss the one real device, and pay the price. Alternatively, the constant stream of false alarms would consume enormous amounts of time. Every dummy had to be treated as real until proven otherwise. The Germans calculated that even a 50-cent piece of wire and an empty box could consume hours of Allied engineering time. At that exchange rate, they could afford to plant millions of dummies. Roadways and transportation networks received particular attention. The German doctrine specified that any obstacle placed in a road should be considered a potential trap. A fallen log, an abandoned vehicle, a seemingly random pile of rubble, any of these might conceal an explosive device triggered by movement. The Germans also pioneered the technique of trapping repair sites. When they destroyed a bridge, they would mine the approaches, the riverbanks, and the materials that might be used for repair. When they cut communication lines, they would plant devices near the breakpoints, knowing that Allied signalmen would have to approach those exact locations to make repairs. This created a vicious cycle. The Allies needed to repair infrastructure to advance. But the act of repair became one of the most dangerous activities of the war. The industrial scale becomes clearer when we examine the Finnish Lapland campaign. As German forces retreated from Finland in late 1944, they planted an estimated 170,000 landmines. But landmines were only the beginning. The retreating Germans also destroyed virtually every bridge, culvert, and road junction in their path. They mined the repair sites. They planted delayed fuse devices in the few buildings they did not burn outright. The Finnish army that followed behind faced not a military enemy, but an engineered landscape of death. Clearing operations continued for years after the war ended. Civilians and soldiers died from German mines and traps well into the 1950s. The land itself had become a weapon, an industrial product of German engineering doctrine. The Allied response to this industrial sabotage had to be equally systematic. British, American, and Soviet forces all developed specialized countermining units whose sole purpose was to detect and neutralize German traps. These units were equipped with metal detectors, probing tools, and detailed intelligence about German demolition techniques. But the sheer volume of potential traps overwhelmed even these specialized resources. The Allies developed a triage system. High-value buildings were searched exhaustively. Medium-value buildings received cursory inspections. Low-value buildings were simply avoided or demolished without entry. This meant that significant portions of liberated territory remained unusable for extended periods. The Germans had achieved their objective. They had turned real estate itself into a liability. The cost in human terms was staggering. Precise casualty figures for delayed fused devices remained difficult to establish. because the deaths were scattered across time and space. A bomb might kill 3 soldiers in Naples, 5 civilians in Kiev, 2 engineers in Belgium, each incident logged separately, none connected to the others in official records. But informed estimates suggest that German delayed fuse devices killed or wounded tens of thousands of Allied personnel and civilians during and after the war. The psychological casualties, the constant fear, the hesitation before entering any building, the nightmares of survivors, these cannot be quantified but were very real. The legacy of these industrial sabotage techniques extended far beyond the Second World War. After 1945, military planners on all sides studied German methods intensively. The delayed fuse trap became a standard element of asymmetric warfare doctrine. The same principles would reappear in Korea, in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, in Iraq. The improvised explosive device, the IED, that terrorized coalition forces in the 21st century, descended directly from German demolition doctrine. The assembly line production of death, the systematic deployment, the targeting of infrastructure and psychology, all these elements were refined by the Wehrmacht and passed down through military academies worldwide. Consider the economics of industrial sabotage one final time. A single delayed fuse bomb might cost the equivalent of $50 in materials and labor to produce and deploy. That same bomb might destroy a building worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, kill personnel who had required years and vast resources to train, and delay an entire army for days or weeks. The return on investment was astronomical. German industrial planners understood this calculus perfectly. They allocated resources to demolition programs with the same cold efficiency they applied to tank production or ammunition supply. Death was manufactured and distributed like any other war material. If you have watched this far, you are clearly passionate about understanding the engineering and logistics of warfare. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel if you have not already. Your support makes these detailed investigations possible. Share this video with anyone who appreciates the hidden dimensions of military history. The German delayed fuse trap stands as a monument to a particular kind of industrial genius, the genius of organized destruction. It required factories to produce the components, chemists to formulate the explosives and timing mechanisms, engineers to develop the deployment doctrine, trainers to educate the sappers, logisticians to distribute the materials, and commanders to integrate the program into overall strategy. Each piece of this system represented an investment of human intellect and national resources. The result was a weapon that continued killing long after the soldiers who planted it had retreated beyond the horizon. In the retreating footsteps of the Wehrmacht, death followed on its own schedule, patient, precise, and industrially efficient. The fields of Lapland still yield German mines today, more than 80 years after they were planted. The forests of the Ardennes still occasionally surrender unexploded ordnance to farmers and hikers. The cities of Italy and France still discover walled-up charges during renovation projects. The delayed fuse trap was designed to kill across time, and in this, it succeeded beyond its creator's most ambitious projections. Those 170,000 mines in Finland alone represent an engineering project comparable in scale to building a major highway or a small city. That this productive capacity was devoted to destruction rather than creation tells us something essential about the industrial nature of modern warfare. The trap was not merely a device, it was a system, a doctrine, a philosophy of warfare. The Germans who designed and deployed these weapons understood that they were fighting not just enemy soldiers, but enemy time, enemy resources, enemy morale, enemy confidence. Every hour an Allied engineer spent searching for hidden bombs was an hour that engineer could not spend building bridges for the advance. Every building the Allies feared to enter was a building they could not use for headquarters or supply storage. Every explosion that came days or weeks after liberation was a reminder that security was an illusion, that the war followed you into spaces you thought you had conquered. The industrial sabotage of the German retreat represents one of the most systematic applications of engineering to destruction in human history. It required the full resources of an advanced industrial state, mobilized not for construction, but for deconstruction, not for creation, but for delayed annihilation. And in this, perhaps more than in any other aspect of the Second World War, we see the logical endpoint of industrial civilization applied to warfare. The same factories that could produce 1 million watches could produce 1 million timers for bombs. The same chemists who could formulate medicines could formulate explosives. The same engineers who could design bridges could design the most efficient methods for destroying them. The delayed fuse trap was industrial modernity turned against itself, a final gift from a retreating army that understood, with terrible clarity, that destruction was just another form of production,